Good evening, comrades. Welcome to a special session of the Communist Forum, which takes place every Sunday at 5 p.m., organized by the Communist Party of Great Britain for an open forum for anybody who would like to attend. Tonight, we're looking at Marx and psychoanalysis and the complex of Freudo-Marxism. The introduction is by Comrade Ian Spencer, who works as a mental health nurse and has studied the subject. His PhD was on the subject of the abuse of psychotherapy in the USSR. So we're looking forward to this session. Welcome, Ian.
Good evening, comrades. Before I start, I have to sort of a whole load of caveats. First of all, as has been said, I'm a mental health nurse. I'm not a psychoanalyst. And from that point of view, I can't really contribute anything new, as it were, to any kind of discussion around Marx and psychoanalysis. The other thing is that my main interest in psychoanalysis was the relationship between Marxism and psychoanalysis in the context of the Soviet Union. As I'll go on to show, there was a period in the early days of the young Soviet Republic in which psychoanalysis was accepted and was part of a whole range of different strands of psychological thought that were widespread. In that flourishing of ideas that one sees in revolutionary times, psychoanalysis was among them. But by 1925, this starts to close down, and I was interested in that whole process. My other interest in psychoanalysis has been clinically. Although I'm not an analyst, my first degree was in sociology and political economy. I have found a lot of the general concepts in psychoanalysis to be extremely useful. One of the areas I worked in, for example, was in a hospital for people with severe and enduring mental illness, the majority of whom had personality disorders, and a high proportion of those self-harmed. And it was an intriguing kind of place to work, where the other point, of course, was that I did study psychology in the first year at university, and the interesting thing about academic psychology in Britain, for example, is that you could do an entire psychology degree in a British university and never encounter psychoanalysis whatsoever. And if you did encounter it, it would only be to usually rubbish it, because the dominant paradigm in British universities is really behaviorism, experimental psychology, and so on. Having said that, I'm not attacking behaviorism particularly. I have criticisms I would make, just as I would of psychoanalysis. But so, in the past, I have treated people, for example, with phobias using purely behavioral techniques, and they're very effective. So I'm not here trying to make myself into a Freudo-Marxist, or for that matter, taking a position with regard to other forms of therapy. But I do think it is interesting to look at the relationship between Marxism and psychoanalysis that has developed, and look at the reasons why it developed and why it developed when it did, and pose the question as to whether Marxism and psychoanalysis can have a fruitful cross-pollination, as it were. The picture in front of you, by the way, is Freud's own couch. I'm not sure how many patients he saw on it. This is taken in the Freud Museum in near Swiss Cottage in London, and it's open to the public, and you're welcome to go and see it. It's also the kind of headquarters of the British Psychoanalytic Association, which is ruinously expensive, which is why I never trained as an analyst. But of course, as we'll see, Freud settled in London after he had to escape the Nazis in 1938, and lived here until he died. Just to be a little bit playful, there is a bit in the economic and philosophic manuscripts, which I'm going to come back to, in which Marx actually mentions psychology. He's also talking in a much wider sense about science. So whilst I don't normally just sort of read stuff out, it's useful to go through it. We have before us the objectified essential powers of man in the form of sensuous, alien, useful objects, in the form of estrangement displayed in ordinary material industry, which can be conceived as well as part of that general movement, just as that movement as a particular part of industry, since all human activity hitherto has been labour, that is, activity estranged from itself. A psychology for which this, the part of history most contemporary and accessible to sense, remains a closed book, cannot become a genuine, comprehensive and real science. Uh, Such psychology as was studied in 1844 would not have, I mean, it's not even clear that what Marx is referring to in here when he talked about psychology, but the understanding of human thought processes and so on, I imagine is part of it. The reason why I quote this is because what Marx is talking about is the question of alienation. And I'm going to suggest that one of the features of psychoanalysis is that it too has a conception of alienation, and that, in a sense, has been part of its richness, compared, for example, to behavioral psychology. But it's also been, in a sense, one of the problems, because as we'll go on to see, um, Marx and Freud had both had a conception of human nature, an idea that there is an essential human nature. But of course, they were very different from each other. Both have a conception of alienation, of being separated from what it is to be truly human, but really very different from themselves. And therein lies part of the conservative nature of psychoanalysis relative to Marxism. And I'm going to also argue, of course, that Marxism has a greatly superior conception of human nature, and that this was then later taken up by some other post-Freudians. In particular, I'm going to focus a little bit on Erich Fromm, not because he's the only one worth reading, but because it's just the one I've read a bit more of, and one of the ones I find most interesting. And he played, I think, an important historical role in his own right. So. Looking at Marx's conception of alienation, a separation of humanity from its species being, is of course not only what makes work such an alien place to be, separated from the product of your labor, separated from the means of production, but above all, of course, humans separated from one another, interacting with one another on a largely contractual basis, not on a truly human basis. For Marx, the transcendence of class society would result in a truly human society for the first time in history. In a sense, it would be the beginning of a truly human history. So here he's looking at the notion of about work as an alien form that we encounter, but of course later on in the economic and philosophic manuscripts he's talking about a world in which we might see in which work becomes man's prime want, because it becomes part of what it is to be truly human, to work upon nature to meet one's needs, and in so doing we change nature, and in so doing we change ourselves. So from that point of view, it's an extremely rich conception of what it is to be a human being. But let's have a little look at old Sigmund here. He's always, whenever you see pictures of Sigmund Freud, he always looks a bit grumpy, doesn't he? He must have been on a good whack. I think he could have managed to smile. He started smoking at quite a young age, and eventually developed buccal cancer. So he always looks a miserable old scrope, because in no small part he had a very painful operation to remove the cancer from the roof of his mouth, and had to wear a prosthesis for the rest of his life. So he wasn't much of a laughing boy, really. So born in Freiburg in Moravia, now Pribor in the Czech Republic. Freud is one of those people that I think Isaac Deutscher referred to as a non-Jewish Jew. I mean, throughout most of his life, he was an atheist, although he came from a Orthodox Jewish background. In fact, I think on his father's side, there were rabbis in the family. I've just realised that I put the wrong date in for his military service, but sorry about that. Anyway, so this was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was and he was a loyal, as it were, citizen of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. During his, the only reason why I put the date for his military service, which is clearly isn't there, it wasn't 1789 before he was born, was for him it was an interruption. It should have been 1889, I think. No, yeah. Anyway, it was an interruption in his studies, and for the most part was regarded as just a bit of a nuisance. He was a great linguist, proficient, as you see there, in German, French, Italian, Spanish, English, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. And the other reason for mentioning his military service, 'cause as you do, you get taken off for a year, and he spent a year translating the works of John Stuart Mill into German, as you do in your spare time. But he qualified as a doctor of medicine at the University of Vienna, worked at Vienna General Hospital. His habilitation, which is a much higher degree than the British PhD. A British PhD in European terms would be seen as a kind of entry-level qualification to academic work. The habilitation was on the basis of significant research. A docent in neuropathology. It's always worth remembering that Freud started out as a neurologist. He didn't start out coming up with wacky theories about people's sex lives or whatever. He was a thoroughgoing neurologist first and foremost. Some of his early work suffered a bit because it was about how excellent cocaine is, particularly for a treatment of psychiatric disorders, as well as the only thing it's now really used for is an ophthalmic anesthetic. But by 1902, he was a professor, and by 1938, he had to escape to London with the rest of his family. If you're wondering about the other Freuds, by the way, the Manchester Freuds, Lucian Freud and all those, and Clement Freud, the former Liberal Member of Parliament and nonce, they were from the other side of the family. They emigrated. He had half brothers who emigrated early on and went and settled in Manchester. This is a lovely picture by André Brouet of Charcot, who was prone to doing these kind of theatrical sessions where he would experiment with hypnosis. And Charcot, again, was the most highly respected neurologist of his day. So this was a plum posting for Freud. He spent about 3 months with Charcot and learned how to do hypnosis and learned from him as a great neurologist. Charcot's also known for giving his name to a type of joint deformity in syphilis and discovering the mechanism for multiple sclerosis. So he was quite a significant figure in his day. By 1886, he's in private practice in Vienna and collaborating with Joseph Breuer. And if you turn to the Pelican Freud library, as it were, the first is really collaborative works between Joseph Breuer and Sigmund Freud. In particular, the case study of Anna O, who was in fact Bertha Pappenheim, and who had a wide range of different conditions, problems that she faced, manifestations of anxiety and so on. And it was published under. It was one of the things that was interesting was that Joseph Breuer had the greatest difficulty of actually writing up this case study, and had to be persuaded by Freud to get his finger out, and eventually they published it together as Studies in Hysteria. The word hysteria, of course, we don't tend to use anymore, and of course, etymologically, it has the same kind of root as hysterectomy and so So the idea derived from ancient Greek philosophy that the uterus exerts a powerful influence over emotions. Who could have thought such a thing? And was actually thought to be mobile around the body. And of course, the term hysteria uh, was in widespread use until relatively recently, and occasionally still crops up in psychiatry when people talk about a hysterical overlay with regard to people, for example, with personality disorders or something like that. So he studied with the best, and the case study of Hanau, it was in fact Bertha Pappenheim who coined the term the talking cure. So without further ado, let's have a little look at Freud's conceptual model of the mind. Most people will be familiar with this. Pick your metaphor. I've gone with the iceberg on the grounds that the whole idea is that the unconscious exerts an influence on us, which we're not necessarily aware of. That strange things happen. People can be anxious and not know why. People can make choices in their life which are apparently difficult to understand. And the idea is that the whole of psychoanalysis would collapse effectively if there was no unconscious part of ourselves. So if you wanted to demolish psychoanalysis, prove that there's no, even the most ardent behaviorists will generally not say that there is no unconscious, merely that because it's unconscious, one can't study it. Most behaviorists, as thoroughgoing empiricists, are only really interested in what you can see and what you can measure. Well, the point about this, of course, is that Freud, again, didn't just make it up. He was engaged in daily sessions with clients, with all sorts of people, and making his observations and meticulously recording them as the thoroughgoing neuroscientist he was. So the id, for some reason, Freud actually didn't use the term id, ego, superego. He used the German das Es, das Ich, das Über-Ich. Apologies to Tina for my pronunciation, but and it's only in the English translation that it became id, ego, and superego, and has with the Latin, and it's kind of stuck, as it were. Bruno Bettelheim is a very interesting kind of psychoanalytic writer who's written extensively written a very good book on some of the problems of translating psychoanalysis into English. For most people, will be familiar with the idea that we have an unconscious life, and our unconscious exerts an influence, and that we're not obviously aware of it. So sometimes it will be things like, well, it'll be revealed in all sorts of ways. The most common one, and this is another feature of psychoanalysis, not only is it a subject to which lots of people have strong feelings about, whether they've read Freud or not, just in the same way that people have strong feelings about Marx, whether they've read Marx or not. The other aspect of it is that notions like an unconscious life is somehow quite a bit strange, isn't it? And also the idea that it's almost the bulk of our psychical life, as it were, is this unrestrained bestial creature, the id, which conforms really to the pleasure principle, the idea that we just want to satisfy all our urges whenever we want. And what we're looking at then is a series of biological drives. Early on, really, this was kind of seen by Freud as being libido, which isn't always best thought of as adult genital sexuality. It's best thought of as a kind of life drive, which is expressed, of course, in sexual terms, but also in terms of wanting to satisfy hunger and a whole range of other kind of personal desires. However, of course, this would render most civilization kind of impossible if we all just satisfied ourselves wherever and whenever we wanted. And so in, for example, Civilization and its Discontents, Freud talks in terms of the importance of the ego and the superego as controlling our drives. And if you like, here is the first of the kind of really conservative aspects of psychoanalytic theory. You see repression as being the price we pay for a civilized society. And because repression is the price we pay for a civilized society, we also look at anxiety and neurosis and psychiatric disorders are therefore the price we pay for a civilized society. The implication is there's no way out of this. This is just the human condition, and all we can do with psychoanalysis is to turn neurosis into normal human misery. The other aspect, of course, that people find difficult in terms of libido and biological drives is the idea that from the outset, the child is sexual. Um, and again, not to be thought of as what we normally associate with adult genital sexuality, but is polymorphously perverse. That is to say, the child takes no particular um, object to its libidinous desires, as it were. And the other aspect that people sometimes find difficult is the idea of stages of psychosexual development. So anyone who's seen babies knows they stick everything in their mouth. And so this early phase, he talks of in terms of the oral phase of psychosexual development. Later on, the child becomes aware of the power of one's bowel movements and passing urine and so on, and the idea of this being pleasing to the parent, and the difficulty that a lot of people also have is with this idea of a libidinous attachment between child and parent, whether it's with the mother or the father. I won't go on at length about things like the Oedipus complex, although I'm more than happy to come back to it. The important thing here is the idea of periods of psychosexual development, oral, then moving to an anal phase, and then discovering the pleasures of one's own genitalia. So, Freud talks about it as a phallic phase. In answer to any question that almost certainly will come up, yes, he was a thoroughgoing misogynist. If you look at his writings, and there's plenty in his writings that show him not just being a kind of person of his time, although he was undoubtedly that, but there was, quite clearly a judgment made in terms of, if you like, phallocentrism, for the want of a better phrase. So oral phase, anal phase, a phallic phase, and then really a kind of period of latency before developing a kind of adult genital orientation towards sex. The other point to make about that is it implies that you go through these in a sequential stage. It implies that the resolution of the oral phase is kind of a prerequisite for satisfactorily moving on to the anal phase and so on. And therefore, the implication is that somehow there is a moral condemnation or a moral attack, as it were, on people who haven't or who become fixated in one way or another, especially if one then sees that as relating to people's sexual orientation. When you read Freud, and I richly recommend it because he's a cracking writer apart from anything else, you don't see any sense of moral condemnation for people's sexual variations at all. You could infer it from talking about a kind of proper move through psychosexual development, but nevertheless, you you don't get any idea that Freud feels that it's in any way rational to persecute people who are gay or anything else. Um, and he's purely interested in it as part of human development or of what it is to be human being. So as you see from the diagram, the majority of this is either unconscious or preconscious. And the task of psychoanalysis is to actually get to those parts of the unconscious, the preconscious, that we're not able to access because of repression. And I'm going to come on to mental defense mechanisms in a moment. Freud's ideas changed over the course of his life. And so on the face of it, we're presented with the satisfaction of sexual and other drives such as hunger and so on. But later on, particularly after the impact of the First World War, it introduced the idea of a death instinct. So the idea of life and death instincts as a dialectical whole, and as part of every human being. And of course, the death in drives, in a sense, for Freud are the resolution of tension. So sexual satisfaction is the resolution of sexual desire, and aggression, for example, as an expression of aggression, of an inherently violent human nature. Again, profoundly conservative in terms of our conception of what it is to be a person. Note here a kind of similarity with the philosophy of Hobbes. Hobbes, writing in the 17th century, is talking about a society without the state. Becomes a society in which life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And you can see a kind of metaphor in the idea of the superego as a kind of a metaphor for the state, the superego being the kind of embodiment of our ego ideal, the idea of our parental ideas and so on. Even today, I can still hear my mother's voice saying, you don't go into a lady's handbag. And that kind of. So we imbue a whole range of social conformity, of parental repression, and the superego as a kind of metaphor for the state is one of the criticisms that one can level at Freud's inherently conservative nature of what it is to be a human being. The ego conforms to the reality principle. The child learns after a while that it's not acceptable to play with yourself in front of the telly or whatever else, and eventually learns to obey the reality principle, obey not only the parents' commands, but also the kind of the mores he picks up from a wider society. Going back to Breuer and the case of Anna O, we come to this notion about transference and countertransference, a very important aspect of psychoanalysis. Transference, Freud noted that people can tend to sort of fall in love with their therapist, and they start to see all sorts of positive qualities in the therapist. It can go the other way as well. They can hate the sight of you. And what Freud was interested in was the extent to which, for example, in the case of Anna O, there was a case of transference and countertransference going on. That is to say, Anna O starts to relate to Breuer almost as a parent. And much of the relationship that she had with her own father was problematic. And from that point of view, the source of the neurosis was being projected, another Freudian concept, onto Joseph Breuer. Similarly, Breuer had the greatest difficulty writing up his work, not least of which because he came to despise Anna and he didn't want anything to do with neurotic women in Vienna anymore. And so what you actually start to get is countertransference. And I would argue that you see transference and countertransference in lots of therapeutic relationships. But beyond that, you see it, for example, in teaching, where students will suddenly see all sorts of positive qualities in a teacher, or indeed negative ones, and relate to them, not necessarily as that teacher, but to a parent or whatever. And I would respectfully suggest that there are instances of transference and countertransference in all sorts of organizations, including left-wing political parties. How else do we kind of understand what went on with Jerry Healy? How else do we understand the sort of dewy-eyed? I used to wonder how sort of dewy-eyed people in the SWP became. All you had to do was mention the words Tony and Cliff in the same sentence, and they would become most animated. So arguably, transference and countertransference is a feature we all experience, and the therapist who is not aware of them becomes a very bad therapist indeed. In terms of the psychopathology of everyday life, what Freud is observing is, of course, that in order to just cope with the day-to-day living, we have to repress our desires, and from that point of view, that becomes the basis for neurosis. Neurosis then is not something that other people suffer from. Neurosis is universal. It's the price we pay for a civilized society, and we all have it. So the idea that there are mentally ill people over there and there are all us sane people over here is cast into doubt by a psychoanalytic perspective. And of course, Freud spent his time mostly with he didn't spend an awful lot of time, as far as I'm aware, with people who are chronically schizophrenic or that kind of thing, but mostly with people with um, where the person retained at least some sort of notion of insight. Turning to mental defense mechanisms, then I'll just mention there are more than these, about five. Anna Freud's Sigmund Freud's youngest daughter, who settled with him in London, wrote extensively about them, and there are considerably more than this. Uh, Depending on which account you look at, but Anna Freud identified at least 10 that are in her father's works. I'll just mention these. Repression is the one that we most frequently see, and of course, it's the one which is subject to, something which is quite painful, and a notion that it's something which is quite unacceptable to yourself. It is quite simply repressed. A notion, for example, around sexual desire, for example, relating to a parent. As we know, there is a whole contentious argument around the extent to which Freud regarded some of the revelations that his patients were coming up with. He first initially thought that these were real sexual encounters between parents and children, and he suspected that, but later subsequently came to regard this as fantasy, and notions of sexual relationships and a notion of a libidinous attachment between parents and children as something which is quite abhorrent and part of an incest taboo. Becomes repressed. And of course, it's not just something as profound as that. Lots of ideas become repressed, things that you don't really want to do. Other mental defense mechanisms are, in a sense, a bit more productive, a bit more useful, in a sense, sublimation. So the person whose sexual energies are maybe to them unacceptable, but is channeled into academic work, or is channeled into artistic work, or so on and so on. Most people will be aware of something like projection, where characteristics seen that are unacceptable in oneself are seen in other people. Always a mean bugger, he never buys a round, and that kind of thing. Well, actually, you never do either, for that matter. So all kinds of things being projected onto other people. Regression, again, is one which you might regard as a bit more infantile in a sense, and it's something I often used to see in clinical environments, where people would appear to regress to an earlier stage of their lives, become quite childlike, childish, and so on. And the extent to which psychoanalysis has entered the kind of day-to-day common discourse is an interesting feature in itself. Reaction formation is an interesting one. Have you ever considered why people talk about homophobia? The idea that, so there's an implication here, if we leave aside the Latin prefix and the Greek suffix, an implication here that because you are identifying homosexual traits in yourself and you want to repress those, you engage in this reaction formation where you're terribly hostile to homosexuals, and so on. And from a clinical point of view, when I've always been kind of aware of mental defense mechanisms as a generalized feature of all people, not just people in psychiatric hospitals, not just people, but in every single day of your life. And the point about them is that they're unconscious and they do what they're supposed to do. They protect your fragile sense of yourself from the awful realization that you're actually not very nice, would be from the kind of psychoanalytic point of view. So, of course, how do we get to this kind of unconscious life, to relieve us of our symptoms, to get to a point where we can actually have some therapy for example, anxiety or whatever else? How do we get beyond the repression? How do we get that far. And of course, what we all know is that Freud had people on a couch. He typically sat behind them at their head as well, so they couldn't see him, so they couldn't draw inferences from his facial expressions or anything like that. And he would use, for example, uh, random kind of associations. Tell me, just tell me all about such and such a thing. And what he would observe for would be hesitation or resistance of somebody, a chain of thought that would suddenly be interrupted. So what's that about? Why was that? The other ones that people are, of course, are much more aware of in terms of expressions of the unconscious are the interpretation of dreams. And if anyone fancies a really good book, if it fancies a really good reading, Freud's interpretation of dreams is well worth the trip. Another one, of course, is everyone knows the Freudian slip, the parapraxis, not just slipping up on words, but also forgetting, for example, that you had an appointment that you didn't really want to keep anyway, that kind of thing. Parapraxis, the slip of the tongue. I remember watching, I can't even remember who it was now. Somebody was on television. I don't know if anybody remembers somebody called Nina Mishkov. He was interviewing this woman called Nina Mishkov, and he actually said on television, I'd like to spank Nina Mishkov for and well, coming here. And I don't think he was even aware he'd said it. He was probably pointed out later. And of course, no one can forget James Naughtie talking about the MP Jeremy Hunt, but mispronouncing his name by just one letter, and in so doing, expressing what we'd all felt deep down for a long time. What I want now is to just have a little look about how the idea, for example, that psychoanalysis in the context, particularly of the Soviet Union, has become something of a threat. Because it's an interesting one, because all the currents of psychology were generally represented in Russia before the revolution, throughout the Russian Empire. Psychoanalysis was pretty popular. The Moscow Psychoanalytic Society was founded in 1910. Later, it became the All-Russian Psychoanalytic Society. And this was about 1/8 of the entire International Psychoanalytic Association. But it wasn't just psychoanalysis in Russia, but it was widespread. There's a point, I think, where Trotsky talks about the intellectual life of Russia being, as it were, grafted onto kind of European thought, as it were. And there's no less so with psychoanalysis. There was a 9-volume edition of Freud's work published in Russian. A special call out goes to Dr. Tatiana Rosenthal, who effectively was the first person to establish a state-run. She wasn't alone, but she had a hand in it, establishing a state-run psychoanalytic institute for treating the traumatized children as a result of the war and civil war in Russia. She sadly took her own life in 1921. Lev Vygotsky, some people will have come across. Vygotsky, I remember some years ago, there was a sort of a bit of a rash, a bit of a phase on describing Lev Vygotsky as a sort of paradigm example of a Marxist psychologist. The thing to understand is that before the Russian Revolution, no one had considered the idea of what a Marxist psychology would be like. It wasn't a question that ever arose. You can look, if you want, at materialism and empirio-criticism and find evidence, well, a suggestion at least, that Lenin was familiar with Freud's work and was critical of it, but nevertheless had no kind of strong feelings on the subject. It's also mentioned in one or two other of his works. Trotsky took an active interest in psychology when he was in exile in Vienna, partly because his close personal friend Yoffe was quite ill at times and gained some relief from having psychoanalytic therapy. But Vygotsky was influenced by all sorts of things, including Spinoza, to a certain extent by Marx, but he also wrote a psychoanalytically influenced essay along with Alexander Romanovich Luria A special call out goes to Luria because he survived. And he survived because he abandoned psychoanalysis. Because by 1924, despite the fact that there had been widespread acceptance of psychoanalysis in the former Soviet Union, it was effectively suppressed by 1925. The beginnings of suppression were beginning in 1925. The institute that Tatiana Rosenthal had established in 1920 was, I think, closed by 1924. And Luria effectively abandoned psychoanalysis, and he was based in Kazan. He abandoned psychoanalysis and to concentrate on neuropsychology. And this was a feature of what happened to Soviet psychology in general. It became, ironically, even more neurologically based than Western behaviorism. So just to next one. There he is. So by 1924, Blonsky was one of the first people to, as it were, call for. Blonsky himself was an SR and issued a call for a Marxist psychology in 1924. The hostility to psychoanalysis had really been developed by 1925. And then you get this interesting thing that happened in the Soviet Union, and it happened at about this time, but continued throughout the history of the Soviet Union. If you wanted to write about something, and you wanted to write about something that it fell out of favor, what you did was you denounced it. So when Valentin Nikolaevich Voloshinov wrote Freudianism, a Marxist critique, if you look at the book, the first half of it is a very good exposition of psychoanalysis. And it isn't written in such a way as to denigrate. It just gives a thorough, this is Voloshinov, the picture, by the way, gives a thorough discussion about what psychoanalysis is. And then the second half is his critique. But in so doing, in publishing it that way, it gets it past the censors. It gets it, I'm criticizing Freud, comrade, the bourgeois psychologist, and in so doing, provides a thoroughgoing exposition of the work. So by 1948, it had been decided that psychoanalysis was incompatible with Marxism. By 1950, the infamous Pavlov sessions of the Academy of Medical Sciences of the USSR effectively made it almost impossible to do anything except neurobiological, psychological research. And there was also something profoundly anti-Semitic about it, in just the same way as the Doctor's plot was seen as was a profoundly anti-Semitic moment in the history of the Soviet Union. The Pavlov sessions effectively meant that the only way you could be a psychologist in the Soviet Union was to be a neuropsychologist. And Luria, of course, being Jewish, fell out of favor about this time as well, before being rehabilitated. And Luria's work is actually remarkably good. Trotsky defended both Pavlov and Freud as being compatible with a Marxist psychology. Well, let's actually look at what he actually said. This is from Culture and Socialism, which was written in 1926. So, Voloshinov is already having to disguise his exposition of Marxism, his exposition of psychoanalysis as a critique. So Trotsky says, Pavlov's reflexology proceeds entirely along the paths of dialectical materialism. It conclusively breaks down the wall between the simplest reflexes the simplest reflex is physiological, but a system of reflexes gives us consciousness. The accumulation of physiological quantity gives us a new psychological quality. The method of Pavlov is experimental and painstaking. Generalizations are won step by step, from the saliva of dogs to poetry. That is, to the mental mechanics of poetry, not its social content, although the paths that bring us to poetry has not been revealed. And on Freud, Freud's method proceeds in a different way. It assumes that the driving force of the most complex and delicate psychic processes is a physiological need. In this general sense, it is materialistic. If you leave aside whether it does not assign too big a place to the sexual factor at the expense of others, for this is already a dispute within the frontiers of materialism. The attempt to declare psychoanalysis as incompatible with Marxism and simply turn one's back on Freudianism is too simple, or more accurately, too simplistic. Freud goes on to criticize psychoanalysis as engaging in what he says sometimes fantastic conjectures, and he's not wrong there. But nevertheless, I think what Trotsky's trying to do is not put forward the idea that either one is a Marxist psychology, but that, so long as it behaves, so long as the psychology is done in a scientifically rigorous way, we don't have to have a view on it. By this time, though, by 1926, careers were made and lost on the basis of which side you were on, and indeed lives were lost. People who subsequently will be sent off to a labor camp or just simply killed. One of the things that was so, I suppose, threatening about psychoanalysis is that given that the Soviet Union based itself on the idea that given that there was no private property, the state had effectively nationalized everything, therefore, on the basis of that, it was a socialist society. But if you have a notion of alienation at the heart of that society, and what you see is alienation not only in the works of Marx, but in the works of Freud, it becomes a kind of ill omen, as it were, to talk about psychoanalysis. So effectively what you ended up with is all the psychology had to have the social content taken out of it. And therefore you ended up with the absolute veneration of Pavlov at the expense of anything else. And actually, Voloshinov's account in 1927 is is not a bad account at all of psychoanalysis. What you see subsequently is a lot of apparatchiki who would attack psychoanalysis in the most stupid way imaginable, saying it's bourgeois idealism or whatever else, which of course, whatever else one can say about Freud is that philosophically he was a materialist. So is there a place for a kind of Marxist psychology? Is there a place for psychoanalysis and a kind of a fruitful interrelationship between psychoanalysis and Marxism? The answer to the first question, I think, is that talk about a Marxist psychology is as ridiculous as talking about a Marxist chemistry or Marxist physics or something. I mean, you might want to, have some discussions about the importance of dialectics in the nature of the world, whether you're talking about subatomic particles or whether you're talking about tectonic plates or whether you're talking about life and death instincts in human beings. But nevertheless, the idea that somehow there is something called a Marxist psychology it is something that grew up in the Soviet Union at that time, but was still being trotted out in the 1990s by people who were touting Lev Vygotsky. I remember going to a Revolutionary Communist Party Mark II conference when somebody was touting Lev Vygotsky as the paradigm example of a Marxist psychologist. Turning to the Frankfurt School, at least two important Freudo-Marxists came from this: Erich Fromm, I'll talk about it a bit in a moment, and Herbert Marcuse. And of course, Herbert Marcuse was something of a darling of the New Left. He was at the Roundhouse Conference, the Dialectics of Liberation in 1967, and wrote Eros and Civilization, which was very much a sort of paean to the kind of notion of sexual liberation in the 1960s. And of course, this is another important point. Notions around repression and sexual repression in particular as being a kind of metaphor for a wider suppression of what it is to be truly human is something which is a feature in psychoanalytic literature. Fromm was effectively a critic of Freud. Fromm abandoned many of the more misogynistic and frankly fanciful presuppositions that Freud was putting forward. But there were, of course, many other contributions from Anna Freud, Karen Horney, Harry Stack Sullivan, and so on. Wilhelm Reich started off life as a Marxist, ended up becoming distinctly odd. But nevertheless, his early works tried to put forward the idea of sexual liberation as a means uh, of as a kind of, not just as a metaphor, but as a relief from the wider social repression in society. Franz Fanon, I think his lasting contribution was the notion about the way in which, in particular in colonialism, which was his area of interest, was the way in which the political, economic relationships were internalized. And of course, this is something that also Erich Fromm takes up, the notion of that, the internalization of the repressive nature of class society. In more recent years, Jacques Lacan has, of course, this sort of return to psychoanalysis in a political way, which has been taken up by Slavoj Žižek, about which I have almost nothing to say. So this is Erich Fromm, born in Frankfurt in 1900 from very Orthodox Jewish parents, studied sociology under Alfred Weber. He was the younger brother of Max Weber, and did his PhD on Jewish law from the University of Heidelberg in 1922. Had been a Zionist, broke with that, and became a Marxist, and trained as a psychoanalyst. Fromm's writings cover a wide range of different topics, and the important thing to try and get across, I think, is that he's trying to bridge the gap between the discussion around base and superstructure. As Marxists, we're all familiar with the idea that, as it were, being determines consciousness. The question for Fromm was, well, how does that happen? How do you go from you grow up in a capitalist society? What's the mechanism by which the ideas of any given epoch are the ideas of its ruling class? How do you go from the idea of humans as they are in capitalist society having a thoroughly bourgeois attitude? If you look at, for example, the London Hanged by Peter Limebaugh, what you'll see, for example, is in 18th century London, the idea that the people would be just used to the idea of private property was something which wasn't readily available to all. Theft was in a population of 600,000, 10% of the population was probably engaged in criminal activity. And so you had the situation where people were hanged for anything more than a shilling and deported to Australia for anything less. So the idea of imbuing a respect for private property wasn't something that came easy. It wasn't a natural feature in some way. It had to be brought about by violence until it could be internalized. And it's the internalization of repression, which I think is an interesting feature of Fromm's work, an idea that you could actually go from economic base, but look at the way in which there is a kind of a structural unconsciousness, a human unconsciousness, which internalizes the very nature of capitalism. Not just capitalism, but also authoritarianism. Fromm writes extensively about the authoritarian personalities. Of course, if you look at Fromm in context, in 1930, Fromm is studying at the Frankfurt School. And of course, by 1933, had to get the hell out of Germany and emigrated to the United States. His other kind of lasting kind of contribution, I would suggest, is an approach to psychoanalysis which is critical of Freud, which takes into account not just Freud's historical specificity as somebody who was largely writing about the neuroses of middle-class Austrian women in Vienna, but also it takes this much further and looks at the way in which neuroses are imbued in an entire population on the basis of the material basis of society. So from that point of view, he's bringing together the kind of instinctual basis that exists within psychoanalysis and tying it to a notion of a being that determines consciousness in the concept of that we see in Marx, and the notion that it ties up with political consciousness. So if one starts to think about things which has fascinated me all my life, why impoverished people will go out and wave flags at a massively overvalued royal family, despite the fact they've got nothing in common with these people. Can we just put it down to a notion of, well, these are just sort of gullible fools who've been reading the Daily Mail, and is that enough? Or is there the notion of a thoroughly imbued deference to leadership, which is a feature of our very psychological makeup? And the other aspect of Fromm's work, I think, which is extremely valuable. I remember seeing Norman Geras's book, Marx and Human Nature, Refutation of a Legend, and thinking, well, that's good. That's interesting. I'm really pleased to see that someone's talking about Marx having a conception of human nature. Fromm was there first. In 1961, Fromm published Marx's Concept of Man, which is published alongside an English translation of the Philosophical and Economic Manuscripts of 1844. And so Fromm is using the concept of alienation that's developed in Marx's work and tying it up and showing how and using it as a critique of Freud's conception of human alienation, and using it as a critique of Freud's conception of what it is of human nature. In other works, such as The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, Fromm goes a little further and talks in terms of, if there is a sort of death instinct, if there is what's the mechanism, for example, where you get fascism. Not the mechanism that we're used to, the idea of and rightly so, with Trotsky, for example, who places fascism in its proper context of the potential for socialism having to be suppressed by sheer brutality. Fascism isn't something that the bourgeoisie want, but they're prepared to employ it against the possibility of a socialist revolution. What Fromm points out is that once the Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party of Germany had been suppressed, the amount of active opposition there had been to Nazism was actually quite limited. And moreover, this doesn't just apply to German Nazism. It can apply to fascism in Italy, or the kind of the fawning imperialist consciousness that one tends to see in the UK. So what Fromm did was actually start to bring out the concept of human nature in Marx and Freud, and look at where there was a potential critical fusion between them. Whether that's successful or not, I'll leave it up to you. What I'm suggesting is that it's well worth the ride. So Fromm was critical of Freud, but also of Herbert Marcuse. Herbert Marcuse was something of a darling in the 1960s for taking this concept of polymorphous perversity, for example, and the notion, therefore, that we're all effectively bisexual, and suggesting that, as it were, that's as good a support as you need, as really for, well, I'm vulgarizing his work, but an important insight into the wide variation of human sexuality and practice. In conclusion, then, I'm not a Freudo-Marxist. I'm not trying to bang the drum for psychoanalysis as a sole clinical modality, but I am suggesting it's worth a read. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you very much, comrade. If anybody would like to ask a question or make a comment, please click raise hand now, and I can make you a panelist. We're only making into panelists people who want to speak, so you'll have to click your raise hand. Before we get going, a question then to you. How did Freud study Marx, to your knowledge? That would interest me, because if you look at his structural model of the human mind, it does look a bit like the base superstructure idea of Marx, which has been a bit can be a bit mechanical Marxist, but it does have the idea that there are different influences on the person, etc. But Freud seems to ignore, if you look at the model, it seems to ignore almost the society, the mode of production, as Karl Marx put it. Is that something he did ignore, or did he take that into account? That it depends on how much control we have over our surroundings, considering the level of repression and those kind of things, alienation.
Freud took an active interest in what was going on. He was a supporter of the Axis cause in the First World War. He would have wanted Germany and Austria-Hungary to win. He was hugely influenced by World War I, and the idea of developing a notion of the death instinct was in large part due to the absolute horror of the First World War. And he was aware of Marx's writings, but I don't think he studied them in any great depth. And I don't think that Hegel, for example, exerted a huge influence on Freud's writing either. But what you do see is a kind of grudging interest in the Russian Revolution and the possibility that there could be a different world. But he never was able to escape the idea that, as I say, neurosis is the price we pay for a civilized society, and this is humanity as it is, and what we have to do is make ourselves better able to cope with the world around us, rather than a notion that we could completely transcend it. So he never accepted the idea that it was possible to transcend a society which was, where neurosis was universal. The best place to start with Freud is, unsurprisingly, the introductory lectures on psychoanalysis, and then follow them up quickly with the new introductory lectures on psychoanalysis. Towards the end of those, there is an interest shown in what was going on in Russia, and the possibility that that there was a social experiment taking place, but he remained as conservative as he ever did.
Thank you, comrade. Bob.
Thank you, Ian. I did enjoy that opening. I thought it was very stimulating and very interesting. Just a couple of quick points from me, I think. Firstly, on psychoanalysis itself as a modality. I've always found it fascinating, and I've always found it, as a socialist and as a Marxist, I've always found it useful to try and understand it where it's coming from. And I always think psychoanalysis provides answers, but it doesn't provide the answer for us as Marxists who want to change society. From a clinical point of view, I want to be quick on a clinical point of view, and then from a social point of view. As you know, I'm a healthcare practitioner. I'm an osteopath, and many of my patients come to me believing they have simple, straightforward musculoskeletal problems anywhere in the spine, anywhere in the body, and you start tapping away at their wider health. That you take a holistic understanding of a person's health, then often is the case that there's a lot of stress and anxiety involved with individuals who present with physical problems, and you start unpicking their particular brain. You get them to download their anxiety about things, and you in one sense you can address the levels of cortisol, adrenaline, these stress hormones that they present. It's a release, and hey presto, their musculoskeletal problems have